Thanks to Bettina and everyone here at the Ludwig Foundation for organising this event. Bettina suggested that speakers might respond to a statement from one of the three artists we're discussing today. So I'm responding to this quotation from Rosemarie Castoro. I think of myself as a container and what I do as an eruption of what I am. My research on Castoro has focused on how she painstakingly catalogues the familiar objects, actions, and temporalities of everyday life, which occasionally erupt into transformative moments of fury, absurdity, and desire. My talk today will focus specifically on Castoro's use of language in her artworks, in her private journals, and in her public statements, where it functions alternately as a constraining, bureaucratic apparatus and as a disruptive force. In 1968 to 69, Castoro developed a system for recording the objects she encountered on a clockwise walk around her studio. She listed these objects in pairs to convey left and right-hand perceptions, referring to what she saw on either side of her body. Some of the objects listed are domestic, such as 2 lamps and 1 TV set. Others relate to her work as an artist, 2 circles and lots of paint, and some are downright vague. Lots of things, 2 things. Castoro assigned each pair of perceptions 2 numbers based on the quantity of the objects or sometimes on their subjective quality for her. In her inventory drawings of 1968 to 69, Castoro used numbers generated in this way to mark points on 2 parallel lines, which she connected with a series of ruled diagonals. These diverging, converging, and intersecting paths record the objects and rhythms of her daily life in highly abstracted form. In his book, Everyday Life in the Modern World, published in the year that Castoro began her inventory drawings, Henri Lefebvre sought to characterize the specific nature of everyday life in the late 1960s. He proposed, quote, to attempt a philosophical inventory and analysis of everyday life that will expose its ambiguities, its baseness and exuberance, its poverty and its fruitfulness, and by these unorthodox means, release the creative energies that are an integral part of it. The serial structure of the list is both symptomatic of everyday life and, for Lefebvre, its means of representation. By cataloguing everyday life, he sought to record and scrutinize experiences so quotidian they usually escape our attention. Lefebvre proposed that the banality of everyday life had the potential to erupt in transcendent moments of rest, play, love, poetry, and struggle. I argue that Castoro's early work demonstrates a similar interest in the everyday and its potential for disruption, even revolution. But unlike Lefebvre and against the grain of some of Castoro's own statements, I propose that quotidian experience is distinctly gendered and that one of the most compelling aspects of Castoro's work is how it records the daily experiences of feminized labor, casual sexism, romantic entanglements, and the simmering frustrations of a woman artist navigating the New York art world in the 1960s and 70s. Castoro's drawing in celebration of part-time work, the spaces between the objects, uses a similar system to left and right-hand walk around my studio, listing pairs of numbers that are used to plot lines between parallel axes. An annotation reads, the spaces between the objects, suggesting that this network of radiating and converging lines maps spatial relationships between items in Castoro's studio or elsewhere. The lines are color-coded, and Castoro used the drawing as the basis for a 4-panel Prismacolor pencil on white acrylic ground painting. In this 13-foot wide work, the lines leap from one vertical canvas to another, bridging the space between, as Castoro wrote in her notes. Like other paintings and drawings in the inventory series, in celebration of part-time work, uses line as a means of cataloguing objects and spatial relationships in a conceptually inscrutable and visually austere graphic vocabulary. As well as logging the spaces between everyday objects, in celebration of part-time work is concerned with intervals of time. Castoro lists the dates October 28th, 1968, April 1969, and on a smaller sheet of paper attached to the lower left of the drawing, November 11th, 1968. Perhaps these dates record the moments when she returned to work on the drawing over a protracted and distracted period spanning 6 months in total. Years later, Castoro described her daily life in the late 1960s and early 70s as being pulled between divergent roles: her work as an artist, her paid employment, participating in works by others, including the dances of Yvonne Rainer and the films of Hollis Frampton, political activism, and her relationship with the sculptor Carl Andre, who she married in 1963. In January 1969, when this drawing was still in progress, Andre began using the couple's loft for meetings of the Art Workers Coalition, from which Castoro was originally excluded. By April, the coalition's meetings had opened up, and Castoro prepared a statement for the open hearing in which she proposed a system of stipends for artists, quote, to free those energies that are otherwise diverted. In light of this statement, the celebratory title of this drawing may be tinged with irony, preempting the Guerrilla Girls' quip 20 years later that one of the advantages of being a woman artist is having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs. This balancing act was particularly perilous for women artists who, as Lucy Lippard observed, were branded dilettantes if they dared juggle art making with other sources of income. Castoro supported herself financially by working for an insurance company where she was employed as a paste-up artist, laying out documents by hand in an era before Photoshop. The designer would give the paste-up artist strips of type, which she would cut up and align on the page, along with headlines and images. These elements were adhered to a board known as a mechanical, which could then be photographically reproduced. It was precise and often tedious work, laying out images and text designed by others, with particular attention to the kerning, or spaces between these elements. During the 1960s and 70s, paste-up was becoming increasingly feminized, performed by women who were derogatorily referred to as paste-up bunnies by the male designers. Yet Castoro later insisted that she had no aspirations to become a designer because, quote, I didn't want to get my head into whatever insurance thing they wanted me to do. She viewed her day job as a financial necessity, setting clear boundaries to ensure that it did not encroach upon the creative energies she reserved for her artistic practice. Like Adrian Piper and Howardena Pindell, Castoro incorporated elements of the paperwork she performed in her day job into her artistic practice, often subverting them in humorous or critical ways. In her studio, she constructed larger versions of the triangles and T-squares she used in her day job and began to treat her primed canvas as a drafting table to be ruled with pencil lines. Even her attention to the spaces between the object relates to her work as a paste-up artist, which involved analysing and adjusting the kerning of a text by cutting, moving, and gluing its elements to produce harmonious, camera-ready copy. Like secretarial work and housework, paste-up work is at its most successful when it is invisible. Only when it fails does a document become confusing or unharmonious. In her artistic practice, however, Castoro used the paste-up artist's ruled lines and variable intervals to render the objects and events of her daily life perceptible and archivable. In controlled arbitrary statements, she allocated numbers to emotional responses, trickling disbelief, roaring anger, needing discipline, which she tracked across 2 days in October 1968. Castoro described this work as documenting emotions checked by inventory organization, simultaneously conjuring a checklist of feelings and a means of controlling them or keeping them in check. Rather than everyday objects, this drawing appears to record and analyse affective experience, evoking the thought records used to track emotions in cognitive behavioural therapy, itself a product of the 1960s. This meticulous self-monitoring continues in Vacation Time of 1970, an 8-page document produced between February 16th and February 20 that year, in a 5-day period commensurate with the working week. Using a stopwatch, Castoro timed the intervals between mundane tasks, such as eating Jell-O to rinsing out a plate, along with actions related to her artistic practice at the time, including thinning gesso, cutting new discs for her sander, finding a screwdriver, and washing her spray gun. Reading Castoro's activity log, it becomes apparent that Vacation Time was in fact studio time, an opportunity to pursue her art making for a full 5 days without the distraction of 9-to-5 office work. Vacation Time parodies the time and motion studies used to measure and increase workplace efficiency from the early 20th century onwards, such as a guide to office clerical time standards published in 1960. This guide collated data from various organisations to, quote, offer the office manager the standards by which labour processes may be organised and calibrated. The activities timed and recorded were those of administrative desk work, including opening and closing files, folders and drawers, chair activity, cutting with scissors, stamping, hole punching, stapling, folding, and enveloping. Whereas the guide lists the standard times for performing these administrative tasks, Castoro records the intervals between tasks without divulging what she was doing in those intervals. What happened in the 28 minutes between her taking off her dungarees and jamming the sewing machine, we might wonder? Did it really take 215 minutes to eat that Jell-O? Or is that a typo, analogous to Castoro pushing the wrong button on her stopwatch, but dutifully logging the mistake anyway? In contrast to the anonymous, efficient administrators whose tasks were recorded in a guide to office clerical time standards, Vacation Time reveals a distractible, fallible, emotional subject careening intrepidly through her daily routine, even as things fall apart. Quote, from looking at this page and pouncing on the word communication, to finishing making a phone call at 6:40 and noting around noontime that I was divorced, Monday, February 16th, 1970, and hearing part of the letter my former mate wrote for his piece in this book show, if you do not frame it after you open it. Castoro appears to have started Vacation Time on the very day of her divorce from Andre, this life event hanging heavy in the studio and permeating her thoughts as she tries to work. In Love's Time, Castoro recorded her actions, interactions, and thoughts a few weeks later, between February 26 and March 1st, 1970. As in her inventory drawings, the objects and actions listed pivot between the domestic and the artistic, such as from boiling water to drawing is what I am doing. Often described by artists as an essential daily practice, drawing has a casual quotidian quality that sets it apart from painting and sculpture. By listing it along with boiling water, Castoro identifies drawing as an everyday activity and a means of recording everyday life. Intermittently, we glimpse references to her disentanglement and separation from Andre when she writes, from storing food to, I would prefer it if you didn't come to my birthday party on Sunday. I'll pick up my papers this afternoon. Or, from a plate full of chicken bones to, how can you stand being away from me? Interspersed with the banalities of Castoro's daily routines, these unexpected moments of disclosure and affect disrupt the detached and bureaucratic vocabulary of conceptual art. The journal is another way of logging daily experience, and Castoro's journals include writings, photographs, and drawings that reflect on her artistic practice. On June 21st, 1970, above a photo of one of her freestanding panels, she describes a brutal, a most ugly, a mass of masochistic pleasure. I write in my journals my reactions to my work. The sentences below this statement are furiously redacted, with her inky scribbles rendering the text illegible and turning it into a kind of abstract drawing, especially when seen in conjunction with the photograph of the panels. In a series of Polaroids pasted into her journals, Castoro swings and spins on ropes and pulleys in front of her freestanding panels, her body and hair dissolving into these vibrating fields of graphite. In a statement published in a special issue of Art News dedicated to women artists, Castoro described how sexist comments by male contemporaries caused her to, quote, become hostile, isolating myself, climbing the walls in my studio, snarling at whoever crossed my path. Yet her journals also detail how she refused invitations to participate in all-women exhibitions and activist groups, and you can see one of these many statements on the right-hand side here, declaring, I don't want to be segregated as part of a quota system. Castoro's journals chronicle these moments of exasperation she experienced with her work, its critical reception, and what she called the comfortable academic niches supplied by curators and society. The tension in Castoro's work between repetitive bureaucratic procedures and emotionally charged graphic gestures culminated in her cutout brushstrokes of 1972. These works were produced by painting single gigantic strokes with a broom in gesso and modelling paste on masonite. The support was then cut around the brushstroke to create a free-floating form that activated the underlying wall as its ground. After covering these forms in white acrylic, Castoro worked them with graphite sticks, as you can see on the right-hand side, so that despite their obvious references to painting, their tonal range was that of a graphite drawing. Drawings' preparatory associations were used to undermine the much-vaunted immediacy of action painting, the practitioners of which had abandoned the sketch to work directly on canvas. Critics were unsure of how to interpret these new works, with Peter Schendal wondering if they could be read as ironic depictions of gestural energy, and he places the word gestural in inverted commas to emphasize this parodic citation of what, by 1972, was a well-worn painterly mode. In fact, Castoro's brushstrokes were not abstract expressionist gestures, but predetermined symbols drawn from Pitman shorthand, a notational system used by secretarial workers and widely taught to American girls in high schools from the 1920s to the 1970s. In her brief history of stenography, or shorthand, Leah Price notes that while Pitman shorthand was initially learned by men and even described as a bond of brotherhood in the mid-19th century, a few decades later, it was deemed degrading for a strong, healthy man to be occupied all day long in using the pen upon what was little more than copying words. By the time Castoro utilized Pitman shorthand in the early 1970s, its gendered connotations would have been readily identifiable, and the coded references of these works would have been intelligible primarily to women with secretarial training. In Guinness Martin, Castoro uses shorthand to write the name Agnes Martin, paying homage to her friend and fellow paste-up artist. Horizontally aligned on the wall, as if on a baseline, the straight strokes, curved strokes, and loops turn the gallery wall into a blank page, marked by her inscriptions, an audacious yet cryptic form of graffiti. In her brushstroke paintings, Castoro locates an expressionist painterly language understood by critics to emanate from the heroic, virile, masculine body with the precise loops, dashes, and curves of Pitman shorthand, a mode of inscription performed in silence at a desk by women. Curiously, the abstract expressionist painter Willem de Kooning painted a series of secretaries and stenographers, or workers employed to transcribe shorthand, in the 1940s, intrigued by these women entering the workforce after World War II. His stenographer is a spectral presence, glowering over a spiral-bound pad that de Kooning is thought to have borrowed from an instructional film on the daily tasks performed by secretarial workers. Perhaps like the Surrealists, he was interested in the secretary as a kind of medium involved in the transmission of messages from one place to another. In Castoro's brushstrokes, this transparent communication gives way to a literal thickening of the signifier, with the stenographer's notations asserting themselves as huge, unwieldy slabs of matter. In concluding this talk, I'd like to point out the relevance of Castoro's work to subsequent artists interested in themes of labor, inscription, communication, and constraint. The swinging, straining body seen in her studio photographs of 1970 prefigures Caroly Schneemann's Up to and Including Her Limits, produced 3 years later, and the Sisyphean struggles of Matthew Barney's drawing Restraint. A Guide to Office Clerical Time Standards, produced in 2013 by the Pill and Gallia Collective, turns the 1960 book of the title into a performance with desk-based actions timed by an ever-ticking clock. And in recent years, contemporary artist Tony Lewis has turned to another system of shorthand, Greg shorthand, to address the history of race relations in ostensibly abstract yet codified form. Castoro's records of her daily life in the 1960s and 70s are more than historical documents. They are lively meditations on work, temporality, and subjectivity, the implications of which have yet to be fully explored. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, we choose those sequences in which you could see Rosemarie carrying things and walking around. And I start with a bit longer question that will be the only long one, I promise this, but just to give you some background information, because the focus of our conservation, as requested by Bettina, is on the exchange between Rosemarie Castoro's work and Yvonne Rainer's choreographies, an important topic explored by Anna and many other authors. Dance practice is especially relevant since Rosemarie also studied dance at the Pratt Institute in the early 1960s and participated in the New Dance Group. While she described herself as a painter-sculptor, it seems obvious that her visual work interferes with her performance work. Given given the emphasis on the relevance of time, and we go back to the motto of our conversation in the second question, in its various meanings and manifestations, the question arises as to the significance of Rosemarie's participation in several of Yvonne Rainer's choreographies, including this piece we just saw, Carriage Discreetness, and this production was part of the 9 evenings of theater and engineering organized in New York in 1966 by the artist Robert Rauschenberg and the engineer Billy Klüver. The production is remarkable in that it was based, on the one hand, on Rainer's concept of the performers like neutral doers, and that will be significant for our talk. Uniform modules, energy balance, found movement, anti-climax, and equality of parts. The piece was based on two simultaneously running control systems. One system consisted of determined but arbitrarily selected actions, which Rainer communicated to the participating performers, including Rosemarie, of course, Julie Judd, the wife of Donald Judd, Karl André, her partner and the one who also designed the props for the stage, Steve Paxton, and Meredith Monk. And Yvonne Rainer communicated her task via walkie-talkie. So it was a feedback system. A second system, a wireless team computer, a theater electronic environmental modular system, generated a second stream of programmed instructions, film and sound fragments. As we could see, the performers executed movements and sequences of actions such as walking, sitting, standing, or lifting and carrying objects, which the dancers performed partly together and partly independently. Since one could speak here of a cybernetic system in that sense, as humans and machines are closely linked, I would like to ask you, Werner, since you are also trained as dancer and you worked as a dancer when you met Rosemarie, whether and to what extent did dance performance at that time form the aesthetically as well as socially and technologically advanced frame for Rosemarie's thinking of painting and sculpture, also in the sense that Anna just addressed the casual quotidian quality?
Okay, that's quite a question. Let me just, before I try to answer your question, say a few words generally. All the previous speakers today are scholars or art historians. I'm neither, but I happen to have met Rosemarie, as we heard in our introduction before, thank you. I've met Rosemarie in 1983, and what I know her of her work from those early days is basically oral history and things that Rosemarie had told me about from that time. Remember, when I met her, I was 20 years old, and I came from a very rural and conservative area. So at that time, those things that Rosemarie told me seemed rather strange to me, right? As you could possibly imagine. But now back to your answer. There are, to my knowledge, three works that Rosemarie participated in of Yvonne Rainer's. We just saw one of them, and as I don't know who it was earlier today, but I think it was David and probably also Anna later. The art world back then was a very close-knit community. Rosemarie moved to Soho in 1964, and back then Soho wasn't called Soho, it was called Soho, which you probably know stands for South of Houston Street. That was created much later. Back then, that area was referred to as Hell's 100 Acres. And when Rosemarie moved there in 64, the industry that was based there just left the area. And artists started to move in because it was very feasible and cheap, and you could get space for little money, which I guess is what artists usually always looking for. And so did, of course, other artists. And as I mentioned, back then there was a very close-knit community, and I guess people just took part in each other's performances, actions, and supported each other. And I guess all those people you just mentioned were basically also neighbors at the time, so it was a clear thing for them to participate in that event, which you referred to the performers as dancers, and I would just maybe call them performers rather than dancers. Of course, dance is a version of performance, and Rosemarie was trained as a dancer, as you mentioned before, but as we could see in the video, one didn't necessarily have to be a trained dancer. Carl, for instance, is not, or was not, and he was part of the situation, and yeah, she performed in that Carriage Discreetness along with those other people, and I think that she again was part of the situation because it was a community thing, for Yvonne to invite those people. Rosemarie never talked to me about Yvonne Rainer. It was never a topic between us. Very early today, I think the first thing we saw today was a film that Hollis Frampton made, and it showed Rosemarie, of course. It showed Lee Lozano. It also showed, as a matter of fact, Twyla Tharp. So Twyla Tharp was another choreographer that Rosemarie knew from the time, and but did not participate in her performances.
I think it's interesting what you say. It was a community thing, and on the other hand, that Rosemarie didn't mention Yvonne Rainer in particular, and I think it might have to do with the fact that probably Carriage Discreetness is so low in the concept of dance. It is so much about doing something.
Right.
Yeah, this what Yvonne Rainer called neutral doing.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
I think there is probably, or my question was not what was the influence of Yvonne Rainer's dance on Rosemarie's work, but more what was the artistic, intellectual climate at that time. What was the foundation of all of it?
Yeah.
And therefore, let me jump a bit. I just show you some illustrations that probably show some resonances between the performance we just saw and these street works, and also Anna already showed these pictures from the journals, and that probably illustrate the resonances. Where I want to go to is also to Anna and Lawrence Halprin's RSVP cycles. Anna Halprin was a choreographer and dancer who, together with her husband, developed these RSVP cycles that, in a broader sense, were also a manifestation of a kind of cybernetic thinking, since it were causal circular systems. And the reason why I mention this is because both Yvonne and Rosemarie were visiting these workshops. And for me, it occurs as if it was a kind of new foundation or new ontology of what they were doing, and it was not so much about influence or the kind of reference as we would talk today about, but more about how to rethink artistic practice in terms of doing. Yeah, and this is also something that probably links to what Anna said. This kind of verbs, this kind of stressing emphasis on doing things, yeah, is something that probably then, grounded or constituted also that what Rosemarie were doing, and she didn't necessarily need Yvonne Rainer for that, but it was a broader context.
Absolutely, sure.
And I would like to go back to the lovely piece you selected as a motto for our conversation and asking you about the specific meaning of that work for you and for your thinking on Rosemarie's work, because it also coheres in a certain sense with Yvonne Rainer's concept of the task as something that needs the time it needs. Right. Yeah.
You mentioned before that Rosemarie called herself a painter-sculptor, right? But she was much more than that. She was also a poet, she was a philosopher, she was a landscape artist, she was a performance artist. So many things come together there, and this just shows, this poem shows, I guess, or sheds light on a different form of her art. And I chose this because as a title for our talk, because in many of Rosemarie's works, time was a very important element. And it says here, time is the space between the appointment and the meeting, and space is, of course, also means two different things, or has two connotations. One of it is room, and another one is time. And Rosemarie did a lot of experiments. Also, for instance, what she did is she experimented on how it would be to have an well, we all adhere basically to a 7-day week, right? And Rosemarie found out that that cycle would not be the right cycle for her. So she experimented, and what she found out is that she would need a 9-day week to really fit her comfortably, okay? So she would only need one Sunday every 9 days and not every 7th days, as we know. Then to get back to the poems, there's another work, a series of poems, which is called 24 Hours in the Life of a Conscientious Objector, which she wrote in 1969 in response to the Vietnam War. And she wrote those 24 poems within 30 days at different hours of the day. So also time there was an important element. Another very important work is Room Revelations, which Rosemarie did for one of Lucy Lippert's Numbers shows in Vancouver. And what Room Revelation was a room that she had let built. It was 15 by 15 feet, 9 feet tall, and it was only had a door, it had no windows, so it was pitch black inside. And she placed a light bulb inside, a 200-watt light bulb, and when the door was closed, the light started from 0 to 100% over a period of 3 minutes. But when the door was opened, the light immediately went back to zero. So what I'm saying is the door needed to be closed for the entire 3 minutes in order to go up from 0 to 100%. If you open the door, again, the light would immediately go back to 0, and then when you close the door again, it would start anew from 0. So people would actually block the door so they could have the experience to go from, from full darkness to full brightness. So time always was just as much as body performance, the need or the use of the body was always an essential part of Rosemarie's work.
And would you say that between these works you were just mentioning and these early works in the context of dance, that there is a connection, the way how the body was being organized in the organization of time? Or would you say the one doesn't have to do so much to do with the other?
I don't have the answer to the question. Most likely there was, because I feel there was always a continuation in Rosemarie's work. So one thing would always lead to the next, or very often there were, so when you look at Rosemarie's works from early on and later on, you don't necessarily see a connection. Sometimes the connection is there, but not very often, I find. But if you follow closely, step to step, you can see it's her work is just a continuation from one thing leading to the next. So I would probably say yes, even though I can't tell you why.
Yeah, because it occurred to me that the work she did for the number shows has also to do with this cybernetic thinking, with this concept of input and output, a system that would change the moment when something enters.
Absolutely, and that absolutely is. Of course, Revelation is the perfect example for what you just said. What's interesting is that, Rosemarie, getting back to Yvonne Rainer and this Carriage Discreteness, Rosemarie was part of a system, and she was given orders to do something at a certain time, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think, if I know it correctly, there were 2 performances of Carriage Discreteness. It was performed on 2 different evenings. And on the first evening, I believe, one of the systems, I believe it was the walkie-talkie, that didn't work, okay? Just like in the beginning of our lecture today. Yeah. But Rosemarie was the kind of person who did not necessarily like to be told what to do. Rosemarie would, as we know in the United States, it's very common to say when you go shopping and you pay, the clerk would say, "Thank you and have a nice day." And Rosemarie would answer, "Don't you tell me what to do." So, so I find it interesting that Rosemarie, took part in those, in that performance, because it was not the Rosemarie that I met later on.
You said that she was rejecting orders. At the same time, she was working with it all the time.
Absolutely, because she put herself in a very tight corset, as just Anna told us about those stopwatch works, which then she put in a certain system, and she made drawings out of them. So yes, but I guess what was important is that she would make her own rules, probably. And those rules sometimes I found are this is not quite the topic, but maybe it makes you understand what I mean is, and I think it's brilliant how Anna found out the system behind, because when you look at it, it's just seems very complicated and mind-boggling to see what the system is behind it. There was in the living area of the loft, Rosemarie had built shelves, okay, and that set of shelf, me as a technician, that was like defying any kind of logic or sense. You know, why did this stay up there? I could not understand. Just like, you know, we say that it's impossible the way a bumblebee is built, you know, that it flies, but it does. And the same was true for what Rosemarie did to me. It was just mind-boggling, and I could not comprehend, but it worked.
The fact that I insist so much, sorry, to coming back to carriage discreteness, and the fact that she did participate, and the fact that she was also working with rule-based works, and I wouldn't agree that she just did only her own rules, and would say, as Anna did, that she was reflecting new regimes of work. On the one hand, of course, female work. On the other hand, you can see that there is a kind of resonance with a kind of information machine, that was becoming the dominant order or organizational principle of work at that time. The Fordism was overlapping with post-Fordist organization of work. And what I was thinking then, Anna, when you were showing the brush strokes and relating them in a great way to the shorthand, drawings and the women at the typewriting machines, I was thinking of Sadie Plan's concept of reverse engineering as a concept to reflect on technology and the meaning of cybernetics for female work, at the same time to turn the rule around and to also parodize it through the way that it was just mimicking that work, but at the same time reflecting the technological base of this kind of work. So I think there is a kind of resonance that is probably interesting, not, as I said, in the sense of a huge influence of Werner on Rosemarie's work, but as a shared interest in the way how artistic work could be redefined beyond the concept of, let's say, consciousness stream-based work in the context of abstract expressionism, but to reflect on emotions of to reflect on effects as a result of a certain type of work that they were performing through the rule-based concepts of artistic procedures. So that is where I see the resonance and why I think that she was absolutely up to date, although she was using the media of painting and sculpture in sometimes seemingly expressionist ways. So that's what I wanted to comment on, and I don't know what you think about.
Yes, no, I'm sure you're right. There's always different ways of looking at something, and I will not. No. I'm not contradicting you. I'm just, I'm definitely not contradicting you. I'm just. I'm, again, telling from my experience.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, 5 minutes? Shall we open up for the audience?
Yeah, I was really interested in the idea of reverse engineering, Sadie Plant's idea, because I think when I first looked at Love's time and vacation time, I thought she was timing tasks, but what she's actually timing is the space between tasks. So it's this sort of dead time or time when she's not disclosing what she's doing. So it really goes against those sort of productivity and efficiency manuals, which are timing the amount of time it takes to actually do something. So I thought that is interesting in terms of your idea of turning the system against itself and making it deliberately unproductive in some way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
We'll open it up to the audience for now and get us going. There's a question in the middle.
Thank you. As I'm coming from dance, wanted just to add that Steve Paxton, the dancer, performer you mentioned before, taking also part in carriage discreteness, he was the inventor of somatic methods. So it was also about feedback system with one's own body. Like he had this famous standing dance. You just stand there and reflect how your muscles react to the fact of you being in space and standing. Just wanted to add.
Thank you, Iris.
And of course, those everyday actions were so important for Rainer. If we think of We Shall Run, like turning just the simple act of running, having the performers wearing their regular clothes instead of any kind of costume. I think Rainer was just as interested in the quotidian as Castoro. So it's sort of, there are a lot of parallels in their work.
And of course, also to see the quotidian as space and side of production, and not only of reproduction, also in overcome this dichotomy and this polarization between female and male types of work. And I think that is also something we can see in carriage discreteness, because she is carrying out male-identified tasks. Yeah.
On top of that, actually, the objects he carried around were created by Carl.
Yes,
so
yeah, there were the plots, exactly.
Hi there. Thank you. This is great. So all of you have talked about the importance of her embodied experience to dance, to gesture, to drawing, to tracking the time that her own body is moving through space. But I was wondering if you could talk or speculate about what happens after all this, which is that transition to sculpture and more three-dimensional ways of thinking about this, which is, of course, very bodily. So I would just like to hear about some of the both continuities or breaks in that move into a different kind of medium.
Yes, let me pick up on a work that's called Flashes. And when I first went to, I'm afraid we don't have a photograph of the flashes.
We don't have, okay.
When I first went to Rosemarie's studio, in 1983, she was restoring some of her flashes. Did somebody mention them earlier? I'm not sure. I think we talked maybe no, I don't know. Anyway, it's a series of work she spent in some way, almost 10 years on, okay? And it started that she got from her mother a cola can, which was cut open, and her mother stuck $20 bills in it, so they were kind of like in this rounded shape. And Rosemarie took the bills out and she crushed them and she stood them up, okay? She referred to them as the bark of a tree, but also as flashes, you know, the kind of men that her mother had warned her, you know. And now those flashes were different forms, but again, when I got there, those flashes were 8 feet tall. They were made out of metal, of galvanized steel, you know, sheet metal, galvanized steel. And I don't know if you're aware of the flashes of that period of work. She had no help, you know. She made those works with her own body, her own muscles, and of course some tools that she used. So there was a big mattress also in the studio, and she had that big sheet of metal there, and she would bounce on it, she would jump on it, she would kick against it, she would Thank you. She would kick against it, and she could have also would use tools and use big sledgehammers or clamps to form it. So it was extremely physical to put that flat sheet metal into the shape that she wanted it to be. And I guess that, so we have some, so again, we see here, just before we had, yeah, okay, she's always, Rosemarie was always, you called her a dancer, which of course is right, but I would just broaden it and say a performer, because she was always performing with her work, in front of her work, and also performing in order to create her work. There's a, later on, there's, I think, a slide which shows her on the floor.
This one?
This is a different, just keep going, please. Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, there is, those, what, David, what you referred earlier to as canvases, freestanding canvases. There were actually panels, okay? There were wooden panels, which she built herself. And there's one slide. Yeah, that's the one. So because she built those panels herself, she always had a way of relating to those materials that she used before she actually, turned them into what she wanted it to be. So, she is laying down, she's caressing them, she's feeling the material before she actually puts them into those panels. So her work was extremely body connotated, because in one way how she related to it, but in the other way also how the physical strength it needed to create them.
Could one say also, in addition to what Anna said, that in her later work, in her sculptural work, that she was much more referring again to blue color work instead of pink
yes,
color
that's
work?
a very interesting thought there. Yeah, going from pink to blue color work.
and also taking a small gesture like folding a dollar bill or the shorthand gesture,
Right.
and then rendering it not just monumental, but something that's also very time-consuming.
Actually, Agnes Martin, which we saw before, the Pittman shorthand, the brushstroke, is almost 4 meters in width, both pieces. So that is not small, And Rosemarie had a tendency of working quite monumental, as if her works were made to be shown in museums, because you couldn't possibly put them in your living room.
And then there's one in the back afterwards, in the far row.
Thank you for the conversation and also the talk, Anna. And my question is posed to all of you, but I think mostly also to you, because you also spoke about the importance of language in the work of Rosemarie Castoro, and language here, of course, understood also between, like somewhere in the space between writing and drawing. And I also wanted to go back to David's talk earlier about the metaphors of the sexual, which of course are so present also in her titles. And I was also thinking about this in relation to her relation to the women's movement, but also in relation to like sexual politics of representation more broadly. We spoke about earlier about the missed encounter between Lee Lozano's work and the feminist movement, but I think it's also very conscious distance also in some ways. And I was thinking about the beaver's trap work, which I think was shown earlier on the slide, where she's sitting inside this kind of vagina dentata that she built herself, kind of entrapped in kind of a female identity, perhaps. And so, I was just interested if you could speak more about the sexual metaphors in language and sculpture in her work.
Yeah, I thought of that work too, because that was the title image for my talk, because of this sort of sense of something erupting from under the ground, but I didn't really have the space to address it. But she said that beaver, Castoro in Italian is beaver. So this is a sort of self-portrait, but it's also obviously a sexual innuendo. So it does tie in with lots of the ideas that David was talking about.
Yeah.
What I think is really interesting is the way she poses within it, and what does it mean for her to be trapped within this vagina dentata. It sort of problematizes maybe this idea of a heterosexual relationship. I don't know, David might have thoughts on that.
I would also like to say something about that.
Me too.
Okay, well, beaver's trap, again, beaver is, as you just mentioned, beaver is, Castoro means beaver, right? And of course, it's also a slang word for vagina. And Bärbel Fischer, who will be up here very soon, chose that work to be in the show we had at the MAC here, 2023. And in many of the newspapers, the work was translated as Biberfalle. So, which means the trap in which the beaver gets caught, okay? Which is wrong, because it's beavers apostrophe S. So it's the trap of the beaver, but not the trap where the beaver is to be caught. And if she's in there, she's not the prey, she's the bait. That's my interpretation. You know, she did not catch herself in there, but she was there to lure somebody in. And what's also interesting about, because talking about vagina dentata, because those pins of wood are very sharp, okay, and so one could be impaled on them. I guess that's the image that we get looking at this. But the way it worked was differently, at least originally, because what Rosemarie did, she sanded each of those branches, sticks of wood, or whatever you want to call them, she sanded them so they were completely balanced. They would stand up by themselves. So what happened was actually that you wouldn't get impaled, but they would tumble over. That was the original intention of that work. But however, when it was first displayed at the Hal Braum Gallery on Franklin Street, they put it in a separate room, which was white, and they figured, well, it would be nice to have a white floor, so they put linoleum down on the floor, white, and Rosemarie balanced the works. And then the sun came around, and the linoleum started to get warm and to warp, and everything tumbled over. So they had to.
I just a short thought about your question, Sophia, is that I see a tension between this concept of neutral doing, because she again and again notes that she's interested in just doing things, yeah, on the one hand, and the metaphors and the metaphorical, kind of transformation in her later works, that it gets a certain kind of meaning that would have been denied in the midst of 1960s. But if you look at that, you could easily compare it with the choreographies where they just were crawling, walking, doing something, and would imply that this would be without any meaning. So there is a kind of oscillation, a tension between both the literal and the metaphorical.
And also maybe interesting to think about this in a tradition of women artists posing with their work, like Louise Bourgeois with her apron covered in breasts, and then Eva Hesse posing with her sculpture, or Kusama, who also posed nude. I'd be interested, Werner, did she show these images during her lifetime, or during the moment that she was making these works? Did she circulate the images of her interacting with them?
Honestly, I'm not quite sure if she did. I don't think she... most of those images are actually taped into her journals, as you mentioned before. And I don't think she necessarily broadly showed them around. I'm sure some people have seen them, but it was It was probably a performance or performances for herself, I would imagine, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, we have time for one last short question.
Hello. I think my question actually moves on from what was just said about the metaphorical. So I'm wondering about, or I would be interesting to hear more about Rosemarie's physical practice, because introducing her as a dancer, right? So she danced. I would love to know more, like what kind of practice she had, how important that was for her, if she continued after making dance or being a dancer and becoming a performer. I'm curious.
I'm not aware of it, and of course she did perform when she was captain of the dance project, as I think you had mentioned before. Yeah, New Dance School, right? She performed then, but she did not later on, to my knowledge. You know, besides taking care in events like Courage, Discreetness, and a couple of other things. And I think the reason being that she just did not want it to be somebody else's tool, and this is what you are when you're a dancer.
But Werner, you probably could also add what you told me, that she then already visited fitness studios before others did that, in order to really get strength and muscles. So being able to produce your work.
There was a lot of talk of feminism, feminists today, and I guess everybody probably would say, yes, she definitely was a feminist, but she always denied being one, or she never. We saw two slides actually where she says, I'm not a woman. I do not consider myself a woman artist. I'm an artist. I do not believe in congregation. I do not want to be, put in a pigeonhole. Also, she said, people, and this is a great saying, she said, people like to refer to myself as a minimalist, but I like to call myself a maximist. Okay, and that puts it to a T. Because it would not be right to just call her a minimalist, because she was so much more. And the must is because she always had the urge to work. She always needed to do something. She could just not work. That was impossible. And if she was not in a studio, which was her favorite place in the world, and she was in the same studio for over 50 years, and I don't know what would have ever happened to her if she had the same misfortune as Lee Lozano, which we heard earlier, who was evicted from her loft in you said, I believe, 1971. And Rosemarie luckily could stay in her loft because she was protected through the New York loft law, which granted the artists who went there certain deals, I guess. And I just said that earlier today to Bärbel. Rosemarie was lucky because Rosemarie basically was, most of the time, was really a starving artist, okay? She always got by, but she never made a lot of money until maybe the last year and a half, when there was not just the appreciation of her peers for her artwork, but also monetary, because she started selling her works from the 60s, okay? In 2013 or so, right? She started selling her early works and finally made decent money as an artist. But the day she died, she paid $475 for her New York loft in Soho, okay? And if she would not have been in that position, and if she would have been kicked out like Lee was, in the early 70s, I don't know what would have happened. It would have been a horrific disaster for her.